So now we are standing in the graveyard of St. Paul's Chapel. But before we mention this graveyard or St. Paul's Chapel itself, I want to talk about the F.W. Woolworth building, which we passed on the way and I pointed out. The Woolworth building was built in 1908 by Cass Gilbert, the architect. And this was kind of the first modern skyscraper to adorn the New York skyline. It was called the Cathedral of Commerce, and it was built as the headquarters for the F.W. Woolworth Company. This company was a five and dime store. It really revolutionized the way we think about retail stores today. The new thought of actually going into a store and picking out products yourself, it was new in an F.W. Woolworth store. Before you would ask somebody to get it for you. That changed. Also, F.W. Woolworth, when he was building this building, he paid for it in cash. Now you'd think he owned a five and dime store, so he has a lot of nickels and dimes. Those must have been very large bags that he went for to the bank with to pay for that building. No mortgage on that building is unthinkable today. Nonetheless, that building when it was built was like nothing before. It's still totally unique with its very decorative style. Also unique to New York City architecture is right behind you, St. Paul's Chapel. That's because it is arguably the oldest building on Manhattan. It was started in 1764 and finished in 1766. The Morris Jumel Mansion in Harlem was both started and completed in 1765. So whether you go by start date or end date, this is the oldest building in Manhattan. Also, during the Revolution and after the Revolution, President George Washington attended Mass right beyond those doors. But that's not why I chose to end the tour here. It's not because it is an old building, it's not because George Washington prayed there. It's because it is a true symbol of what makes this city great. Now its location here is important because it was nearly destroyed twice. Once during the Revolution when the British forces set this entire block on fire, people climbed on top of the roof and fanned the flames out. Secondly, September 11th, 2001, right over my shoulder, the World Trade Center, 8:46 in the morning. Plane flies in, hits the North Tower. 17 minutes later, 9:03, plane flies in, hits the South Tower. Clearly this was not an accident, it was an act of terror. Later, pinpointed to the extremist organization Al-Qaeda. At the time, total panic was ensuing. Minutes after the planes hit, both buildings collapsed, sending rubble crashing down a smoke cloud, a toxic smoke cloud, way up in the sky. It spread 40 miles. You could feel it for 40 miles around. The toxic smoke cloud could actually be seen from space, like outer space. That's how massive it was. You know, with all this commotion, this travesty, somehow, some way, this chapel, this small, tiny chapel, completely undamaged. A true miracle. The story of the World Trade Center does not begin on September 11th, 2001. That would be a totally pessimistic way of looking at it. It actually started in the 1960s when ground was struck in 1966 to build these two iconic buildings. They were designed by architect Minoru Yamasaki, an Irishman. He might have been Japanese, I'm not quite sure. However, when he was first building them, it was really architecturally uninspiring. He built two rectangles, let's face it. There was nothing that great about it, ornate. There's no great detail that went into it, like the Woolworth building, or the Art Deco style of the Empire State Building or Chrysler Building. Also, all the way up high, the windows were only 18 inches wide. That kind of spoiled the greatest thing about a tall building, is that it's tall and it has a great view. Engineering-wise, though, this was a wonder. It was amazing that a building could be built this high. A bathtub was carved out of lower Manhattan to keep the waters out. The steel mesh was so light it used 40% less steel, and it was also designed to withstand the force of an airplane flying into it. However, it could not withstand the fuel that airplane would disperse. However, when the buildings were first put up, they weren't that popular. After all, they did take the crown from the Empire State Building. As I said, the view from the top wasn't that great, and more than anything, the surrounding area was dull, the art was lifeless, and nobody even really wanted to be in the buildings. None of the businesses, all the businesses had moved to Midtown, and it was kind of during an economic lull, so there wasn't any great business expansion back into the buildings. However, in 1974, that somewhat changed. The French tightrope artist Philippe Petit hung a tightrope from the North Tower to the South Tower. And then one day in 1974, he decided to walk across that 8 times in 45 minutes. A true act of rebellion. Waiting for him when he got off the beam were New York City officers. They arrested him, booked him. However, the building owners begged the cops not to press charges, which they eventually didn't. He was actually given a lifetime pass to the observation deck. However, why would they want no charges pressed? After all, this was an act of vandalism. Well, it's because Philippe Petit gave those buildings a face, gave it a character. In a city where there are tens and dozens of large buildings, ginormous buildings, a building needs something more than just height to make it great. And that's exactly what the World Trade Center towers needed. They needed a face, an identity, some kind of characterization. Philippe Petit gave them that. Decades went by, there was still kind of an economic lull that hampered the development of the buildings. However, during the globalism and the boom of the 90s, businesses started moving into those buildings rather than moving out of the city. This was huge for New York, and the area was alive. Unfortunately, just as it was getting going, 9/11 happened, the buildings were destroyed. In total, the destruction amounted to just under 3,000 people, including 343 brave firefighters. But as you can see, New York has built back up. They have withstood the destruction and gone higher. Literally higher by the new tower, One World Trade Center. The original plans for this development were and for that building, the Freedom Tower, officially called One World Trade, were designed by Daniel Libeskind. However, those details were just too intricate, too complicated, and so a much more simple design, yet still beautiful, was implemented. This was designed by David Childs. Just recently, like a couple weeks ago, this actually became the tallest building in the Western Hemisphere. It eventually will stand 1,776 feet tall, a symbolic reference to 1776, when, again, this nation started its path towards independence. So, back to St. Paul's Chapel. Nearly destroyed twice. But it's still here, it's still standing, and it's still a symbol of the resilient spirit of New York. No matter what happens to this city, whether it is an occupation by British forces during the Revolution, whether it is the stock market crash of 1929, whether it is the Giants being down to the Patriots in the fourth quarter of the 2012 Super Bowl, whether it's September 11th, you can be assured of one thing, that New York will rebuild, it will not be conquered, and it will be on a constant trajectory upward, higher and higher, on its constant search of becoming the greatest city in the world. So think back to the beginning of this tour when I did tell you that this was the greatest city in the world. I'm not sure that it is. The greatest city in the world, I think, is New York of tomorrow, the next day, and the day after that. Because this city keeps on getting better. It has one vision, and that is greatness. And so, I think we can all conclude that New York will be the greatest city in the world tomorrow.